So today, luckily, I had none of the online meetings,
Okay, all right, all right.
and it was good, So I also wanted to hear him out.
Yeah, I
We've
know.
been, we've been, he's been telling me what he's been doing. So I thought, this would be interesting for me to have a glimpse of
I know. The minute
him.
Opie told me about this, I said, that sounds very exciting.
Hello, Ruchika.
Hi, Sudha.
Hi, Sudha. How are you? Long
I'm good.
time.
I always ask Mayank about you, that how you are doing.
Oh, great, great.
So
Thank
he
you.
did tell me.
I hope he tells you the right thing.
Yeah.
Great.
So
So
all the
so good
best.
seeing both of you. It's
I
been
know.
so long.
It's been, yeah, just about 15 days back, I was asking, where is Ruchika? And look, here you are today.
So you
You.
just disappeared. So it's
Yeah.
good to have you back.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm just back for this 2 hours, I think.
Never mind.
Never mind, never
Let's
mind.
remain in touch.
Great. Thank
Okay.
you. So you guys, Amrit is there,
Amrit should be joining. She's there, very much there.
and this is Vats. Is she
She
there?
is retired.
She's
Retired.
retired.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Yeah.
Anil,
Anil is still there. Anil is
Anil
still
is there.
there. Yeah.
Okay, so I do remember a lot of
Yeah,
you.
you remember all of us. Sucheta joined JNU.
Suchita, I'm aware, yeah. She joined again thanks to Mayank. That's how I know that she's joined.
Sucheta
Okay,
joined JNU.
all right.
Now her son has also completed his PhD. Submitted his
Oh,
thesis. Yeah. Oh,
wow.
hi Mayank, how are you?
हेलो कैसी हैं आप?
बिल्कुल ठीक, आप कैसे हैं?
मैं अपनी तारीफ सुन रहा था तब से और डर लग रहा था कि पता नहीं सुधा जी क्या कहते हैं।
मयंक
अरे
अब तू गलत नहीं
हम
बोल,
आपकी
मैंने आपसे पूछा है.
हम आपकी तारीफ ही
मुझे
करते
डर
हैं.
था कि शिकायत ना कर दे कि बहुत बदमाशी कर रहा था।
नहीं 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 नहीं, वो हम नहीं कहते.
क्योंकि हम लोगों ने एक बार रुचिका को बुलाया था भारती कॉलेज में
हाँ जी.
एज अ कंसल्टेंट फॉर द स्टूडेंट्स कि व्हाट आर द अदर एवेन्यूज, सो शी इज अ
Yeah.
गुड रिसोर्स पर्सन इन दैट सेंस एज वेल।
All right. Oh, that's a good thing. Ruchika, you please send me your whatever contact point. I was just thinking, I was going to ask you this question. Do you address the students also in colleges?
I do.
I
Well,
apologize. I
I
apologize for the interruption, but we'll start the event in
Yeah,
the
yeah.
next
Okay,
few
okay.
Please do.
minutes.
Yeah, no, please start, I think. I think you start.
I'll wait for just one more minute and then I'll start the event.
Yeah, please.
Okay. I guess I'll start the event then. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Road 2021. Today, here we have our speaker, Shashank Shekhar Sinha, who would be speaking on the topic. Uh, who is- who would be speaking on the topic monuments and understandings of history. So before we get into the topic, I must remind you certain rules for the event. Please have your mic and camera switched off. For the question, after the lecture, we'll have a question and answer session for which we'll have you can raise your hand, which will be available in the bottom right corner, and we will and in orderly fashion you can ask the question to the speaker. We we also have some other questions which were given to me before the event, so we'll also go through that afterwards. And I and if in any antisocial behavior would be liable to strict action by the Itihasa History Association of the Delhi College of Arts and Commerce. So coming back to the lecture, Monuments and Understanding of History, I'll first give a small profile on our speaker, Dr. Shashank Shekhar Sinha. He's an independent researcher and public historian and currently works as publishing director, Routledge, South Asia. He has earlier worked with Oxford University Press and taught history at undergrad colleges in the University of Delhi. Working at the intersections of history and cultural anthropology, he has authored a book and several journal articles and book chapters. He continues to research and publish on a regular basis in areas including tribes, gender, witch hunting, violence, popular culture, and heritage, both for serious academics and popular media. In the last few years, he has been publishing articles on UNESCO Heritage Sites with the idea of addressing the gap between academic and popular understanding of history. His book, Delhi, Agra, Fatehpur Sikri, Monuments, Cities and Connected Histories, will be released later in 2021. Dr. Sinha also features in programs related to history and heritage in television channels like NDTV 24/7, Rajya Sabha TV, News 18, as well as newspaper write-ups. So, for today's lecture, Monument and Understanding of History, this talk will explore some anecdotes or episode connected with three famous and most visited World Heritage Sites, Qutub Minar, Taj Mahal, and Fatehpur Sikri. The presentation will show how certain anecdotes rooted in the popular domain start acquiring historical character over a period of time, how some events, episodes, or occurrences in the afterlives of the site and write-up surrounding them become the dominant frameworks for understanding the history of these sites and related historical period. Looking at the long-term histories and the site under discussion, the talk will investigate some popular stories connected with the monuments at the three sites and the divisive politics of the colonial rule. It will also highlight the gaps of our understanding of these sites. So, please, sir, you may continue the lecture. I'll switch off my mic and camera now. Thank you, sir. We are grateful to have you here.
Thank you, Sourav. Thank you, the DCAC History Association or Itihas for giving me this platform to share my views on a topic that I've been working on in the recent years. It's very good to see many of old friends there, so that makes things very, very heartening, and so good to see many young friends organizing this meet despite and such an optimistic note despite a lot of pessimism that's going around. So thank you very much. I think I was just planning to have unlike many other lectures, I was just trying to have this lecture. I was thinking that I would have a conversation. A conversation would go around three stories that I have to say. One story each on Qutub Minar, one story each from Qutub Minar, Fatehpur Sikri, and one from Taj Mahal. Very common stories that you all hear of. But the stories tell us a lot of thing about how histories are made, basically, and what is the thin line between popular and academic history. So broadly speaking, there are two or three things I want to underline at the beginning of the talk. That monuments play a very, very crucial role. They're not just important for the historians, but they are very crucial to public understandings of history, not just in India, but outside of it as well. So when foreign tourists come to visit monuments, they form an idea of India through the sites they visited, basically, if they are not too familiar with the country. Second, its monument is not just about the builders and the architecture, but also the related historical periods. And one of the other things that I have been working on in the last many years is that they also have significant afterlives, right, which go beyond the life of the builders or the primary builders. So the afterlives is a very important component of the monument. And the third thing I want to underline is that how there is a big gap, a very big gap between the way knowledge is produced in academic settings and how it is consumed at the historical sites. Right, so those are the things that I'll try and highlight during this talk as well. But let me begin by saying, what I feel, and I always share, with young friends, is that, in many ways, I think, history or ideas related to history or ideas claiming to be history are in, greater circulation, right? So, there's a renewed interest in interest. One could, differ on the depth and the quality of that, but, there is a greater, renewed interest in history, basically, and greater circulation of ideas on history, related to history, or claiming to be history as well. And this has been made possible through a variety of things, the IT revolution, the technology, the social media, and there is always this constant factor about how politics keeps throwing us back into history, basically, which we, incur on a day-to-day basis. Now also on the various social media platforms as well. And then there are several informal sources that have opened up, as I said at the beginning, that one could differ and debate on the quality and the intensity and the depth of it, but there are several informal networks through history, through which ideas related to history or claiming to be history are being circulated. So one is the films, the films and the television. We see many serials which are based on historical narratives or historical events. Then you have historical fiction, novels or comics. Then you have stories which are circulating in Facebook, WhatsApp, and other social media platforms. I see a lot of thing happening in the field of heritage photography these days, right? And one of the other things that when I used to go to this sites, one could always see a lot of pre-wedding shoots happening in this monuments. So and then there are things about the selfie with the monuments or selfie with the historical objects, and there is a big way in which heritage walks have come into being. So now you have this heritage walks as becoming very common. And as also alongside all those things, what you also have are basically podcasts, videos, and blogs writing to history. So there's a huge increase in the informal networks of history, or informal networks through which we get ideas about history, or ideas which claim to be representing history, or and as I said, one could differ on that, and these coexist besides the academic understandings of history or academic ideas of history, which are mostly produced in universities, college, and research settings. Basically, I remember when I was growing up, there were two other very informal sources, basically of informal networks. One was that the Amar Chitra Katha. So that used to be, that used to operate parallelly. So a lot of, thing about history and historical fiction, we would learn from the illustrated Amar Chitra Kathas, and of course, the grandparents, narrating two stories about one of the, I think one of those beautiful things and that as well as dangerous things about history is that, everybody has a sense of, history, good, bad, ugly, whatever it is, but, has a sense of it. Now, among all those things on informal networks, what is it that makes the monuments unique, or what is that makes the monuments central to any understanding is that? Now, and there are two things here: monuments and museums. Now, why are monuments and museums important as compared to any other sources or any books or comics or films or whatever? And that is because these are the places where these are the tangible sites. Right? So in your day-to-day interactions with history, these are the most tangible sites. What do I mean by tangible sites? These are the sites, monuments and museums, where you are face to face with in case of monuments with buildings, but in case of museums with historical artifacts and objects. Right? So you are face to face with history. You are experiencing history. More in the case of monuments, because you have these buildings and the narratives that go around the building, that here this king, whatever, as the guide would say, took a bath, here he ate food, or here the queen was, this was queen's beauty parlor, whatever the kind of narratives that you get to hear about it, right? So then there is the whole idea is that about, that monuments, and there are more visitors to monuments than to museums, right? That is also by the statistics. So when you go to monuments, you're face to face with with history, basically. Right, you're face to face with objects, buildings, and the related, paraphernalia. And these are, so what you're doing is you're experiencing history, and not just history of the builder, but also the related period, right? And you come back with certain imagination of the history of that period, basically. Now, the depth of this experience that you have at any site depends on the kind of knowledge you have about that site. Right? Now, let me come back to it, let me, deconstruct it, layer by layer, right? And the depth of the knowledge that, beginning with the depth of the knowledge the visitors have of the site. Right? Now, broadly speaking, and I'm using very broad categories, though I'm mindful of the intricacies in between. Broadly speaking, let's begin with saying that there are two different kinds of tourism: the foreign tourists and the domestic tourists. Right now, the foreign tourists could be having some understanding of the historical past, or may not be. In most cases, they come as tourists, basically to enjoy and experience the culture, the architecture, and things like that. And they either read about it on various internet sites, or do some reading in advance, or read some books, or go in for self-help books, or take the help of guidebooks, or in most cases take the help of tourist guides. Right now, one of those things which makes their experiences important, or sometimes through what they call interpreters or translators, basically. But what they do is, whenever they do that, and if they do not have a very good understanding about the past, or do not have any familiarity about the site's past, it is also some kind of, it's like taking away a slice of India. So it's also forms some kind of on their part, some kind of a civilizational encounter, So, and some, idea about what India is all about, right? So when I say that, it impacts public understandings of history, not just in India, but also outside of it. So that's it. Now, with the domestic tourist, again, broadly, these two categories operate. One is that, there are tourists who are familiar, right, with this, with history, they're familiar with, they could be different layers of familiarity, right? They could be familiar with the site, they could be familiar with the history, they could be familiar with the period, right? Though, monuments, do not form a core area of study except for the portions on architecture, and they serve to illustrate the text, basically, right? So you don't get to see, and I work in this area, and you don't have too many good books on monuments outside of the Archaeological Survey of India publications, so that's still an area which it is evolving. But most of them, and in terms of numerical majority, most of them, come without, any formal, grounding in history. So most of them come with what they say that, school book grounding. They've all read about it in the school books, right? So when they visit the monument, it's something that things start coming alive to what they had read. They'll say, okay, this is what I had read about Akbar. So he used to be in this palace, and the queen used to stay here, So it's something like, rebrushing, right? And for some, it becomes like some kind of a refresher course. Okay, so coming alive parts of it. And for the dominant majority, this is what happens, when they visit monuments. They all come back with some impression, some idea of it, which acts, or which, reformulates or consolidates their earlier understanding of history, basically surrounding that site or surrounding that historical period. Now, when people visit monument, what are the sources of information, and how is the knowledge consumed or produced around monuments? Let's come to that bit of it, right? Now, some of them, do a lot of search before. Some very, there are some visitors who are very, very conscious of plan their trips very carefully. So, and I'm talking about the domestic tourists now. So they read a lot of stuff. So to begin with, one of the things which they read about is a lot of stuff on the internet. Now, surprisingly, when I was researching on it, I saw a lot of travel sites, and those tourism sites, the same stuff being, repeated, without, verbatim as well, and sometimes with minor modifications. So you have the same set of same content, which is being repeated on the different, travel sites, basically. I'm not saying, saying in terms of generic trends. There are sites which are good. There are sites which are more which offer deeper information. But in general, most of the common tourism sites offer the same kind of information around them. But generally, most of these people, who come from who constitute the non-history public, or come from a more, generic background or a non-history background, for them, the site is the place, or the monument is the site where they, basically formulate or reformulate or consolidate their understandings of history around the site, around the topic, around the builder, around these things. Now, so when you come to site, there are three different kinds of sources of information that you have. The first one, or just before the site, the first one is, of course, many people still look at it, now with the phones that are so smart that you look at it, you immediately do a Google search and look at the various tourism sites or things like that, which I talked about. There is a lot of duplication in the content over there, but dominantly two different kinds of sources. One is the tourist guide, right? And the other is that, if you have a more informed approach, then you try and go to the publication counter on the site and then buy, what is called one of those books, basically the book guidebooks, the Archaeological Survey of India guidebooks. Right now, talking about the guides, and I have been in the last many years, gone to some places repeatedly with different guides as well. And one of the things when I started digging deep into it, I realized that their idea, and this is thanks to the profession, their idea is to make it an enjoyable experience for you, something that you enjoy being there. And so you say, okay, I went with this and this guide. So the primary idea is to make it very enjoyable for you, right? So there's a lot of element of entertainment that comes into the narratives, the guides' narratives. I'm not saying they're all same, but dominantly, most of them, bank on very racy narratives, try to get you elements of folklore, popular history, things that keep you interested, basically. And, sometimes there is a lot of invention that goes on there in the narratives, which is very surprising, which is not surprising, because the idea is to make, things very enjoyable for you. Now, the interesting bit is that most of these guides are trained at travel and tourism management institutes, right? So, which are not adequately equipped or, trained. And so they are not adequately equipped or trained to deal with very, the intricacies of sensitivities of history, basically. Right? And I always feel that, and I'm not too sure whether they're aware or conscious, or mindful of the fact that sometimes their narratives could create more dangers in terms of understanding, or the damage that they could do to understandings of history, basically. Right? Now, as opposed to that, those people who are want to have a little more informed approach, what they try and do, they try to go to the publication counters. Now, one of those funny experiences that I had is that, when you look for a book of a particular site at a particular, a book on a particular site at the site itself, there are very few occasions that you'll be lucky to get it. I don't know why that has happened, but perhaps also because those books get sold easily, and then the replenishment is not so easy. It takes a bit of time. Now, these are good books, these are good help books, right? But the problem, there are a couple of problems there as well, right? And these are books which are, they have very attractive photographs, but a lot of it is very academic and a lot of it is very technical, beyond the understanding of people, the dominant majority of the people who are visiting the sites, as I said, the non-history public. But one thing which is, even more, noteworthy is that many of these have not been updated for a very, very long time, right? And some of them have actually been written in the first decades of 20th century, and they have been illustrated with some very nice photographs taken by a hired photographer. A photographer that they rented, and the photographer did some very good shots. And so there's an old content and repackaged with lots of very beautiful photographs, right? Some very stunning photographs as well, right? So, for example, I'll tell you, if you look at, the thing about Qutub, it's based on J. Page's content, J. Page's content, right? Now, Qutub, the understandings of Qutub have changed significantly in the recent years, in as late as the last decade, basically, how, the whole idea of Qutub is also changing very fast, the way we understand the monuments at Qutub. There is another layer as well when we come to monuments and when we come to experiencing the monuments, which is the entirety of knowledge, around monuments, or even if not entirety, a large spectrum of knowledge around the monuments. And by that, I mean that most studies that I've seen, of the monuments or around the monuments do not feature in the afterlives of the monuments, right? So the monument have a life which goes beyond the primary builders. They don't cease to exist, like the builders, right? They have a life, after that as well. And sometimes, this is something that I've had done, lectures earlier on in about the afterlives of monuments, very, dedicated lectures on afterlives. Sometimes the events or episodes or anecdotes connected with the afterlives of the monument, become the dominant framework for viewing that monument or researching that monument and knowing about that monument. Right? Now, for the people, for the non-initiated, if you just by way of a rough example, not a good example, though I must say, for the non-initiated, when I say non-initiated, somebody who's not so integral to the first things that you ask, many of those younger generation people is that what is the first thing that you come to know about, what do you the first thing that you want to say about the Red Fort or Lal Killa in Delhi, and one of the common answers that I was, that I get is that, it's the site from where the Prime Minister addresses the nation. So then the Independence Day celebrations are held. Now, Independence Day celebrations were not a part of the original scheme of the monument when Shah Jahan built. It happens much later. It happens much later and is connected to a distant geography. This connection comes from Subhash Chandra Bose's INA movement in Burma, Myanmar, which is now, and when they formed the provisional government there, and Subhash Chandra Bose apparently visited the grave of Bahadur Shah Jafar, and then the whole Red Fort comes into focus, and then his Delhi march talks about that there is a need to fly the flag of independence in the Red Fort. So he talks about that, and this whole idea about Delhi Chalo is connected to that. So when the first Independence Day celebrations were held, Jawaharlal Nehru actually remembered Subhash Chandra Bose, right? So but then this is an afterlife, right? We have been talking about Delhi more in terms of Old Delhi, Shahjahanabad, and later in terms of, even more importantly, in terms of the 1857 rebellion, which happens around 200 years after the building was made, basically, right? So then so I'm talking about also that there is another level of thing which goes into which is the afterlife. It adds another layer to the understanding of the monument. Now, what happens to the knowledge that is being generated in the institutional setting, right? In the formal academic institutional settings, how is the knowledge produced and consumed there as well? There are quite a few disciplines now. You have history, you have archaeology, you have architecture, you have heritage studies, a lot of things which are happening there, and some get into the technicalities of it. I'm limiting myself to history, basically, right? Both, in the capacity of somebody who was associated with researching, was a student of history, was for some time associated with teaching of history at undergrad levels, basically. So when it comes to, monuments are not taught by way of a separate topic or a subject or the idea of experiencing monuments. They are mostly seen as illustrating the text, right? Illustrating the context. We talk about monuments in the context of architecture. So, it could be Indo-Islamic architecture or Mughal architecture or Sultanate architecture. So we talk more about monuments there as well. But in terms of, in general, in terms of books, what you see is that, a Red Fort is added whenever there is a talk about 1857 rebellion. So there is a photo there, right? In terms of general textbooks that you see there. Now, in terms of when we talk about interdisciplinarity, I don't think that we have reached the desired level of disciplinary exchange, So I can say that with a certain amount of certainty in terms of my research of the monuments, that, there is not much, despite all this talk that goes around interdisciplinarity and interdisciplinary collaborations, there's still not much of a regular and systematic interaction between history and archaeology, basically, and that you see in the research and that you see in the books on this thing. So there are books on art history, there are books about archaeology, there are books about, general history, but not much by way of a very systematic exchange and very systematic interaction. The other problem is about the language, right? So the language, in the academic language, sometimes it's not so accessible to make a sense to an ordinary, a non-history public, or a person who's not initiated in history. So the language, of the knowledge produced in academic settings sometimes is, and this is in no way I mean to say that, I'm against that kind of language. I feel that, the research has its own rigor. So I'm not in any way suggesting that, but I'm talking about just in terms of how that knowledge transmits to, or how that knowledge is consumed, at the site, which is a very important, uh, place for formulations of your experiences of history. So the language is not so, not so accessible, and there are not too many translations, and primarily in English, of course, and there are not too many translations available in Hindi or other regional languages. So there are some gaps in the way knowledge produced in academic settings create, some challenges that knowledge produced in academic settings have to face while negotiating the consumption at the sites or at heritage sites. Now, is there an element where these things could be, or are there platforms where these things could be made available in a simple, accessible forms? Right? I already talked about the guidebooks, right? And the guidebooks are not updated. They do not go congruent. They are not always very congruent with the latest research that is being produced in academic settings. These guidebooks, the guides who are are a primary source of knowledge, who take you around the monuments, are not very equipped, and not very equipped, or not very conversant with the knowledge, or the recent knowledge, or the recent research that is being produced around the monuments. And in India, one of the things I noticed was there is no concept of somebody who is kind of an intermediary between the knowledge produced in the academic settings and knowledge consumed at the sites. And these come by way of public historians in the West. Now these are people who are trained in history, right? And they are sensitive to methods of historical research. But public history or public historians as a trend did not pick up very soon. And these are the people who are placed at different places. They are placed at films, they placed at archives, they placed at televisions, they placed at heritage sites, they are placed at battlefields. So the public history as a trend did not pick up in a big way in India as well, right? Now, thankfully, I noticed that there are some online platforms, popular platforms coming up where academics have been writing in the way in which it makes sense. So there are shorter articles around things which are written in a more accessible form. But generally, in terms of, there is this gap still exists in terms of how things could be there, right? How things could reach there. So what am I saying? What am I saying in what I have said in a nutshell? Before I go on to the three stories that I have to tell, is that one, that monuments are one of the most tangible sites in your everyday day-to-day interactions with history. Number two, that there is a significant knowledge gap around the sites, right? Around the sites where bulk of common people and non-history public formulate, reformulate, or consolidate their understandings of history, right? And therefore there is this increased reliance on popular histories or other informal sources. And I always feel that history in untrained hands could have very dangerous implications, right? So that is one of the things that which should be mindful of, that if there are untrained people, and one of the things I say that it's not, history is as important as many other disciplines, and that it's not that while we may all be having a sense of, or a commonsensical sense of history, the degrees of it may differ, and it requires sensitivity and training in history to deal with some complex things as well. Now let me come to the three stories that I want to tell today, and my idea of telling you these three stories is primarily to alert you about the various possibilities of the various gaps that have happened in the process of knowledge formation, and how they continue to haunt us, how they continue to be a part of our legacy, how they continue to be a part of public truths, right? And my first case study, and I would request Sourav to, I have just got some photographs here, right? Just to keep the focus on the photographs. So I would request Sourav to, share the slides if possible. Sourav, are you there? Fantastic. Thank you so much. I assume that since I'm also getting to see the slides, so you would also be seeing the slides. Can we move the slides, Saurabh, to the third slide, or the second slide to begin with? So what are these case studies? So these are case studies, as I said, about three different sites, very common stories. All of you have heard, about these common stories, but it's important to talk about them. That how are there some gaps which completely modify our understandings of history. So can we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, I think there's some problem sharing that. So let me tell you about the first. Okay, fantastic. So before that, the previous slide was about a disclaimer where I acknowledge that I acknowledge all the copyright holders. Most of the photographs that I use, these in slides, are mine, but these are mainly for educational purposes and internal consumption, not for any commercial. But most of these things are mine, but it's places where I have used someone else's visuals, and I acknowledge that. I respect the original copyright to these visuals. And then let me just move to the third slide, the next slide, please. Basically, right. And this is a story, that some of you who knew Sunil Kumar well would be very familiar with. When you go to Qutb, and this is a story which is called how this is how Qubba Islam, which is Sanctuary of Islam Mosque, or Delhi's first Friday. This was Delhi's first Friday, the Congregational Mosque, right, became Quwwatul Islam Mosque, which means the might of Islam, right? So these are two different things. One is called Sanctuary of Islam, which and the other is might of Islam, right? So two very different frameworks, offering completely altering the meaning, perhaps. Okay, let's go through that, some of those things. So can we change this slide, please? So this is for those who haven't been, most of you would know that this is Qutb. When you approach Qutb, next please. This is the frontal view of the what is now known as. So when you go to the site, you see that this is now known as Quwwat al-Islam Mosque, which means the might of Islam. Okay, can we have the next slide, please? So here you have here you have to your right you have the entrance, and to your left you have the plaque, ASI plaque, but you can see that it says Quwwatul Islam Mosque, right? So it means, it says that it's a might of Islam Mosque. And the right, this is the thing where you have the controversial inscription, which acknowledges that, yes, there were temples which were broken to, construct this mosque, the makeshift mosque, basically, right? Can we go to the next slide, please? This is the interior of that, right? So this is where you can see the pillars, from the temple. So unlike other mosques, you see that these are the mosques which look very much like the interior of the mosque looks like the temples, basically. Can we go to the next slide, please? And this is the other view that with Qutb in between, how it looks from the other side, basically. In this case, from the southern side. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, let's come back. Let's come back to the earlier one. Sorry, let's come back to the earlier one. Right. Okay, so now comes the story about that, how this thing about being now. As far as the inscriptional evidence is concerned about this structure, the only two words which are mentioned is imarat or masjid, which means either a building or a mosque. There is no other inscriptional evidence anywhere, to talk about what was the name of this mosque, right? Now, historians feel, and this was one of those ways in which Sunil Kumar and David Lillyweld, talk about, these things as a history, audience, so I can talk about these names, as well. This is where historians feel that, Quwwat al-Islam comes from the corruption of a word called Qubba Islam, right? So the might of Islam is a corruption of the word Qubba Islam, right? Now, how does it happen? They said that Quwwat al-Islam, which is the might of Islam, does not appear in any inscription or any chronicle, right? Or any source, basically. On the other hand, Qubba Islam or Sanctuary of Islam, right, happens in a 13th century text by Minhaju Siraj Juzhani, right? And where he he uses this sobriquet to metaphorically refer to two things. One is Iltutmish's reign in Delhi, and second is to talk about the spiritual domain of Bakhtiyar Kaki, the Sufi saint Bakhtiyar Kaki. Right now, many of you would know that in 1220s, there were Mongol invasions in eastern Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia. So as a result of which people are migrating, lots of people, are migrating, which are soldiers, which are ulema, which are general people as well, amirs and general people as well, migrating to towns in North India, right? Delhi being one of them, right? And Juzani says that, Iltutlish's Delhi is able to attract, people from different parts of the Islamic, heartland. And that it has become a keeper of Islam, or a dais of Islam, or an axis of Islam, or a sanctuary of Islam, right? So that is, he uses the word in that context, right? And the other context in which the word Qubba Islam, or the sanctuary of Islam, is used is in the context of the spiritual domain of Bakhtiyar Kaki. Now, Bakhtiyar Kaki, Iltutmish held him as in very high esteem, of course. The Iltutmish, the ruler of Delhi Sultanate, the Sultan held him in very high esteem. And Qutbuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki, some people say that the name Qutub Minar traces, though that is debatable, of course, that gets its name or derives its name from Qutbuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki. But what is important here is that he was, Bakhtiyar Kaki was seen, and in the contemporary literature, there is a word which is used, the expression which is used is Qutub Sahab ki lat, means the staff, or the, lat is the stick, basically, that you used to walk, So he says, Qutub Minar is described as Qutub Sahab ki lat, right? So the idea is that, and he was taken as Qutub, or an axis, He's often been described as a Qutub around which the world revolves. So it was said, metaphorically, that like the Sufi saint, who was, believed to connect the heaven and the earth, and along with his, lat, or the stick, So he emerges as some kind of a, his domain of spiritual domain emerges as some kind of a Qubba Islam, right? And his stick is what connects the earth to the heaven. So these are the two different contexts that the word Qubba Islam is used, right? Now, when does this word, Quwwatul Islam come into being? We do not have an exact date, but perhaps somewhere in the early 19th century. And two instances where David Leddyveld points us to is that, Mirza Sangeem Beg's, Sairul Manzil, which was published in 1819, which is an account of the Quranic and Persian and historical inscriptions of Delhi, does mention the name Quwwatul Islam Mosque, which is the Mytul Islam Mosque, right? There was another text published around 1845-46, which is called Karim Khan Jazari, which is a Persian manuscript. It talks about this, it takes about a broader survey of the world, where again he mentions this term, Quwwatul Islam Mosque. So it was, in circulation. The term was in circulation in the second, third decade of the 19th century. But there's a momentous turn that comes into being with, Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who was the very famous Muslim reformer and educationist. He publishes his Asar al-Sanadid, which is basically the first, systematic book on the monuments of Delhi, right? Which has gone through two editions. One was in 1847 and the other one was in 1854-55, right? The first edition was more about, celebration of the life of Delhi. So it was very uncritical. But the second edition, it is said 1844-85, he came under this influence of what is now known as positivism, or then also was known as positivism, which is reliance on very objective facts. So the fact-based history, so very positive history basically. And he came under influence of some European thinkers as well, right? So when his book Asar al-Sanadid was published, it refers to three different terms. One is called the Masjid al-Adina, second is Masjid al-Jami Delhi, and the third one is Quwwatul Islam Mosque. Right? Now the third one stuck. And the third one stuck also because it was congruent with the dominant narrative around the mosque, that yes, there were conquerors who came, who destroyed the temples, and then erected the mosque to announce the arrival of a new political, socio-political, religious dispensation. Right? So the word stuck, Quwat al-Islam mosque stuck, because to them it sounded more logical. And then it was carried on from there to colonial, was being used by colonial officials. Archaeological Survey of India, because Sayyid Ahmad Khan has friends in archaeological, had friends among archaeologists, and later the Archaeological Survey of India comes into being, later in the second half of 19th century, basically. Also, this term, found a fancy with the colonial administrators, and therefore I'm going to request, Sourav to bring us to the next slide. Is it possible, Sourav? Can we? Okay, this is the next slide, right? Now, what you would see that here is and it fit. It was very, very, played a very strong, role. Like many other monuments, I talk about several monuments which play around that time, 1870s, 1880s. That form a very, very important role in the way British rule were trying to portray India, and then trying to glorify or vilify certain rules. And they said that, look, that was a period of tyranny, and that the British establishment of British law and order brought about peace and stability in the continent, right? And that the Muslim rule was a very violent one. So they used this element of Quwat al-Islam mosque. And so what they did was, models of their, plaster models were made of this, pillars of this thing. And they were being displayed in 1870s and 1880s in Kensington, South Kensington Museum, which later came to be known as the India Museum, right? And the idea was to display there, that look how the other rule was a violent one, and how we brought in a lot of, this thing. So it is trying to create some idea about India as well. Now, what happens is that, so that it fits, the new terminology fit in well with the colonial scheme of periodization, the colonial scheme of things, and with politics about divide and rule. And later it started, and it was also used in J.A. Page, did some archaeological survey of reports in early decades of 20th century, which formed the basis of the current ASI book as well, right? So it featured in there as well. So that this material that, Sayyid Ahmad Khan is producing, because he's taken as a positivist who bases his things on fact. Now, when Sayyid Ahmad Khan had mentioned, he did not mention about any prior history of these three terms from where the Quwat al-Islam thing came into being. But what it happens is that, it picks up gradually, it picks up because of a variety of socio-political interest involved here. J.A. Page, cites it in his, archaeological survey reports. And then it also features in very strongly in the guidebooks that were being produced around that time, guidebooks of people like Fansave, Gordon Weasley, J. Horowitz. So these are the guidebooks which are reproducing that narrative. And with this partition, nationalist scholars have also been using this framework with the idea of that, Pakistan is a Muslim identity and India is a different identity, and they have been using this framework, of Quwat al-Islam mosque. And therefore, this becomes a commonplace. And now also, you see it also represented in the plaque. So that's how, despite evidence against it, it finds mention. And this, when you display it on a plaque, you see that there is a problem there, in terms of not being backed by adequate, historical evidence. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Okay, did Jodhabai exist in history? If not, how and why are places or structures named after her at Sikri? Now, there are two kinds of things that I'm going to mention here, right? Can we, next slide, please? Okay, so when you go to Fatehpur Sikri, this is the left-hand side, it's written there, Sabista Iqbal Jodhabai's palace, right? Now, for a very long time, this is a very good correction that the ASI has made. For a very long time, it used to be known as Jodhabai's palace, right? But now Jodhabai palace features in bracket, right? And then on your top right, you have the entrance to Jodhabai's palace, of course, which is the Haram Sara, Imperial Haram Sara, or the Harem, basically, which is popularly known as this. And the one on the bottom is the internal view of it, basically, right? Of what is popularly known as. Can we have the next one as well? Yes, and in front of that, you see there is a thing called Haram Sara offices, which is Jodhabai's kitchen. So there is a monument, to your right of the screen, to the right of the slide. You see a monument there, which is popularly known as Jodhabai's kitchen. So Jodhabai's palace, and you have Jodhabai's kitchen, right in front of it, right? this is a monument that all the guides will make it a point to take you and will show you, motifs which are known as, earrings, jhumkas, So this is a very famous monument, it is a very nondescript otherwise, but the guides will make it a point to tell you, right? Now, there is another palace which exists near to it, before I go on to it, which is called the Birbal's Palace, popularly known as Birbal's Palace, which is next to Jodhabai's palace, right? Popularly known as Jodhabai's Palace. Now, I remember one of the things I was taking one of the guest lectures as LSR, and one of those the students told me that, but they, we are talking about her, but Jodha Akbar as a film, does not say all these things about that, right? Jodha Akbar says that this wife is there. Now, yes, Akbar was married to a Rajput queen. Akbar was married to the eldest daughter of Amber ruler Raja Bharmal. But the name Jodhabai is nowhere mentioned in any historical record, either in Akbarnama or any other contemporary record, right? And she certainly was the mother of Jahangir, certainly, right? Yet the guides who would take you would mention in great details that here she would do worship, here she would do, this was her temple, here she would take out, here in the courtyard she would organize festivals and things like that. And the palace next to it is taken as Birbal's house, right? Now, important thing is that Birbal's house, or a palace which is known as Birbal's Palace, cannot exist next to Jodhabai's palace, right? And no male palace could exist in the imperial harem for anybody who has a basic sense of understanding, right? So obviously it is popularly known by Birbal's Palace, but it can simply not be in that harem area, and there is a wall between the public and the private area, which has now been demolished, to facilitate in the various excavations that have happened. But earlier there used to be a wall between that, right? So how did it come into being? It possibly come into being because late 19th, early 20th century, there are a lot of foreign tourists, British tourists coming to visit these sites, and the guides who are taking them around are naming them conveniently that this is Jodhabai's palace, this is Todermal's Baradari, this is Tansen's Baradari. So that is how this myth comes into being. Just like any other myth that that we have been used to, is this myth about the 9 jewels, the Navratnas in Akbar. Yes, there are people who are very famous and who are known as Navratnas, popularly known as Navratnas. So these are people who are very famous, who are very skillful, and very very, very able, who figure in Akbar's Darbar, certainly. But, there's no consolidated list anywhere in contemporary literature about, or list of Navratnas. There's nowhere there, And there was in 2015, there was a big controversy, public controversy, when then there was an announcement that, the statues of Navratnas would be put into the place, put into palace, Now, these, it was eventually, there was a lot of controversy, and it was eventually decided to do that, but not because it was ahistorical, but because that it violated the Ancient Monuments Act, right? So it was so that you cannot continue. But there is another one, and let me come to the part 2 of Jodhabai's story, basically, right? So there's part 2 of the Jodhabai's story is that and this is again where you have a very dominant narrative, a very strong narrative coming from the tourist guides, that Fatehpur Sikri declined as a result of shortage of water. Right, so there was a huge shortage of water, and Fatehpur Sikri declined. There's a very famous, there's not famous, a popular local legend, which is called the curse of a courtesan called Zarina. So Zarina happened to be a courtesan in, according to this popular story, in Akbar's court, and she was falsely implicated in a theft which involved, Jodhabai's golden bangles. Now, we have already talked about Jodhabai's historical existence in the first part of it. Now, the second part of it we are talking about in terms of a theft, where her golden bangles are supposed to be stolen. Zarina is caught and she is falsely implicated, and then she is penalized, and she curses that, Fatehpur Sikri would die of, shortage of water, and this town would be deserted. So it says that it is Zarina's curse, courtesan Zarina's curse. Now, when we look back at the history, and here, Nadeem Rezavi's, research comes in very handy, is that, water was never a problem there. So when Babur campaigned, during the Battle of Khanwa, he talks about a well-watered space around Fatehpur Sikri. And when Akbar comes, he dams that water body and makes it into a lake. Right? And when you go through a sightseeing of Fatehpur Sikri, or when you happen to go there, you see a lot of water bodies. You see tanks, you see step wells, you see hammams, you see waterworks, you see garden channels, all are there. So, water was, a part of the planning of Fatehpur Sikri. And Hakim's Babli, one of those famous ones, which is still known, Hakim's Babli still supplies water to the town, right? And can you please, take on to the next slide, This is a body, a tank which has just been discovered, say, 2 months back, a month, 1.5 back to be precise, in Todermal's Baradiri. What is the structure which is known as Todermal's Baradiri? A square tank with a fountain. So this goes on to show that, water was not a problem there. The problem about, Akbar leaving Fatehpur Sikri in 1585 and never coming back was the death of his half-brother, Mirza Hakim, who died in Kabul. And then there are problems, that, there's of stability in the northwestern part of India. There was a Uzbek problem. There was political instability, because of the Shah of Persia being there, So to bring about some stability, he camps at Lahore for the next 13 years and tries to, develop and make peace in the area and also commercially develop that area around Lahore. So he camps at Lahore for till around 1598. And when he comes back in 1598, he goes to Agra as opposed to coming to Fatehpur Sikri. Right. So and then because Deccan was then in a very bad state, in a very politically very disturbed state, there were a lot of rebellions in the Deccan, and later his son also Salim also rebelled, basically. So Akbar was there at Agra trying to pacify these revolts, and it suited him well, basically to have it Agra, and he never came back to Sikri. But then, so how this comes into being? This comes into being because of certain travelers, one of which I can, tell you about this. William Finch, who visits, Sikri around 1610, much after, Fatehpur Sikri has, passed his phase of an imperial city. And he says that it's a waste desert, it's deserted, it's abundant, and soon after Akbar left. So that is, those kind of travel narratives, in the in the aftermath of Akbar leaving the place and staying and coming back and staying at Agra, gives this kind of a narrative of pulling that. Now, what is important to see here is another historical distinction that Nadeem Razavi also makes is that and he says that his research says that indigo and carpet manufacturing continued to be very important in the region. Sheikh Salim Chishti continued to invite a lot of pilgrims from different parts of the country. And Jahangir and Shahjahan continued to come to Sikri, right? So the decline of Fatehpur Sikri declined. So Fatehpur Sikri did not decline because of shortage of water. There is enough evidence, including the one that you see on your screen now, that they would have enough water. But it declined. It has to be seen in terms of what is seen in we use it, at some places in history is the decline in terms of the status of the city from being an imperial city to being an ordinary city, right? So sometimes, and one of the other things that you see this happening very continuously in the context of Sultanate and in the context of the Mughal Empire, that the cities acquire capital cities in terms of the movements of the emperor or the sultan, right? So if the sultan moved in, Delhi Sultanate, the city would require a capital city in a structure. And sometimes, in the Deccan, as during Aurangzeb's phase, the tent cities also acquire some kind of a symbolic status of the capital. So they would stay in tents, and the tents were mobile cities, basically very, very elaborate mobile cities as well, right? So it all depended on the movement of this. So Fatehpur Sikri, either in terms of Jodha Bai's, problem, or in terms of, the second connected problem of the decline of Fatehpur Sikri, has to be seen more in the context of how this, how there are certain gaps in the historical knowledge that we have. And now I come to the last part of my this thing. Can we have the next slide, please? Did Shahjahan plan to make a black Taj? Now, anyone who goes to the Taj, I have seen, comes across, guides, who would tell these narratives. There are many narratives around the place, which would be told by the guides in several details, basically. One is in that, one of the things that they say is that, Shahjahan wanted to build, a black Taj on the opposite bank. The other thing that they would say that Shahjahan cut the hands of the workers, so that they do not, make any other similar structure like that, And so these are the parts of narratives, that are become very important of the popular history of the Taj. Now, one of the things I always feel is that, rather than being completely dismissive about these popular histories, because no matter what you say, people want to hear about these stories, always, and particularly tourists want to hear about this. They have heard about this in various sources. And these, in the case of Taj, popular history sometimes take a precedence about the over the academically researched narratives, basically. They become a very integral part of the Taj. So people want to hear about these stories in a very significant way. So they want to guides to say कि अच्छा ये था कि नहीं था करने के लिए बनाने का था plan, वो death कैसे हो गया, and all those things that they talk about that. Now, there were many common myths which started coming into being ever since the Taj came into existence, right? And one was this whole story about, one was this whole story was about attributing Taj to a foreign architect. And this process started right from the time the Taj was built. So there are different names which are thrown up. One was of Geronimo Veronio, right? The Italian goldsmith who designed the Taj, which is by the Spanish friar Manrix, Then there is this story about the Frenchman Austin de Bordeaux, which is very, very, repeated quite often by William Sleeman, who's done a famous work on the thugs. It was a British armyman administrator. And then more towards the early decades of 20th century by in Begley and this book, where they talk about Isa Effendi of Turkey, about attributing the Taj to the foreign architects. And this is now, these myths keep coming into. But more popular than this myth is the myth of Black Taj, right? And I'm talking there in the context of the travelers. How does this myth come into being? This myth comes into being by the writings of one, French merchant and traveler. Those days, the traveler used to, were merchants as well, So they would come, they would sell stuff in the courts, make money, and also, stay there. Sometimes as physicians, some of them would stay as physicians because they had some knowledge of the Western medicine. And some of them would, document, some in Fatehpur Sikri, there were a lot of Jesuit missionaries who would stay there and trying to teach Akbar, various aspects of Christianity. So this was a very common thing. So this French merchant and traveler, Jean-Baptiste, Tavernier, comes, he visits, Agra twice. One when Taj was, near to conclude, completion, which is 1640-41, and another in 1665. He is the guy who says, that, it was built over 22 years with 20,000 workers working daily. Tavernier is the same person, right? So he says that Shahjahan wanted to make his own black tomb in black marble on the opposite bank. So if you look at Taj is on the banks of Yamuna, and it is in different in a different location to it has a different planning as opposed to other charbags that you talk about, whether in Humayun's tomb or any other place. It has a different charbagh scheme, where the monument lies at the end of the garden, not in the center of the garden, as in the case of Humayun's tomb. So he says that, so Taj Mahal was, located on the bank of the Yamuna. And he says that they were opposite the Yamuna, right opposite, Taj Mahal is the Mehtab Bagh, what is now known as a Mehtab Bagh. He says that, in the Mehtab Bagh, he wanted to build a black tomb, right? So, the black tomb would be the counter image of the white tomb, Mumtaz's white tomb, basically, right? And so it was up to that. Now, this thing caught in the popular imagination, and in the subsequent discourses, what you see is that, this tomb is also being seen as, linked by a bridge, So in the popular imagination, it is being said, basically that, this was linked by a bridge. Can we have the slide, please? Next slide, please. So this is the Taj Mahal. Next, please. This is Percy Brown imaginations, of that, So if you can see, it's not a very clear picture. That you see there is a white Taj on your right and a black Taj, and it's linked with a bridge, basically, in between over Yamuna. right? So the black Taj is in Mehtab Bagh, white Taj is in the Charbagh, which is on the other side of the Yamuna, and it's linked with the bridge. So this is the new dimension that comes into being, that yes, there was a plan, right? Now, Schliemann, who visited in 1836, adds another layer to it. He says, it was the death of Austin de Bordeaux, who he thought was the architect of Taj Mahal, that got to the decision that led to the decision of Shah Jahan erecting another one. Otherwise, Bordeaux would himself have done it. And both Tavernier and and Schliemann speak of the second factor, which is that Shah Jahan's sons were against this idea, that why should so much expenditure go in, and in principally opposed to the idea. So Aurangzeb had to abandon that thing, basically, right? So this is how the story goes. Now, can we have the next one, please? The story, gets credence from another very, very important thing which is said, and they say that about the popular, the people who advocate for a popular history, is that says that the only asymmetric feature in the Taj is the location of the grave cenotaphs. So Shah Jahan's thing you see is not at the center. The one in the center is Mumtaz, and to your left of the screen, is Shah Jahan's Shah Jahan's tomb. So it says that this is a very asymmetric, is the only asymmetric feature that comes into play in an otherwise structure which is thought to be completely symmetric. Examples of its symmetry are given in anywhere across the world in terms of Indo-Islamic architecture, what is popularly known as Indo-Islamic architecture. So they say that it must have been an afterthought. And the thing got so much currency that, next slide please, that ASI had to excavate the other part of this. So the 1990s, there were major excavations on the other side in the Mehtab Bagh. So they did not find any evidence of the tomb, Black Tomb. What they instead discovered was that there was a full planned Charbagh, which is now known as Mehtab Bagh. So this is, I took it from the ASI board. And the next one, please. And this is when I went there. So it's like, this is how, it's being, doing there, basically, right? So then the whole idea was that, there was no Black Tomb. So what purpose does it serve? Why do you have this whole discourse on Mehtab Bagh? Taj Mahal was supposed to unite two Charbaghs. One is the Charbagh which is in front of Taj Mahal, and one is the Charbagh which is across the Yamuna. Right? And the idea was twofold. One was that the ethereal tomb would be seen floating. If you see it from this place, which is being shown in the screen, if you see it from the Mehtab Bagh side, it would be seen, Taj Mahal would be seen as an ethereal tomb floating on the sacred waters. Right? And then it stood at the center of a symbolic paradise. So, next slide, please. And that is where I would end that. So this is one of my friends has given me this photograph. He took. So this is exactly the sentiment that So it was trying to create an enhanced symbolism about the idea of paradise. So Taj stood at the center of two Charbaghs as a center of symbolic of paradise, and it added to the vision of paradise. The tomb, ethereal tomb floating on what was known as the sacred waters. On that note, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the enlightening and the interesting lecture. We are very glad to have you here. So I will start with the question and answer session. If anybody has a question, they can use the raise hand and can ask the question to the speaker. So feel free to ask question and make this a more conversational and interacting session. Does anybody has a question? Okay, Mansi, you may ask the question.
Hello, sir. Thank you for the session. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So my question is that, as sir mentioned, that we now have a very convoluted sense of history because of the politically, like how the political ruling classes have uh, cooperated history into their narratives, and how whether it's like the uh, whether it's modification of history for entertainment purposes, or how it has been changed in the oral popular history. And so we have somehow been distanced from what history was, and like there's a distant understanding of history from the facts and like the studies which have been done. So I was wondering how dangerous is this uh, today? Like, how vulnerable does this make history to be modified and cooperated further? And what are the implications of it?
Uh, Thank you, Mansi. I said about two things. This when you make this point about convoluted sense of history, I did not just talk about. Perhaps I did not mention the ruling classes, as well. So this convolution, or this kind of introducing several layers, also emerges in my case. I make into this thing in the way we have, about the whole idea about the knowledge is produced and consumed. Right. So one of those things that we have been very dismissive about popular histories, and these histories play a very important role in the way non-history public engages with the idea of history, or the people who are not trained in the idea of history, they will engage with that. And therefore I talked about how there's a very significant gap about the knowledge that is produced in the academic setting and the knowledge that is consumed on the heritage sites. And these heritage sites are the sites, or the monuments are the sites, where non-history public or most of the commoners tend to rebrush or reformulate or formulate or consolidate their ideas about history of that site, of the builders, of the related historical period. So there are very significant knowledge gaps that have to be addressed as well. And as long as these knowledge gaps are not addressed very systematically, in terms of a knowledge continuum, so there is an academic knowledge and there is a gap, popular history, these are existing, in two different narratives. So two things I would advocate: that you would need to engage very creatively and constructively, like the way I told you, right? So one of the things I always find is that, when the guide talks about the idea of Black Taj, she or he talks about great details, but when you deconstruct the idea through a similar story, that also produces, if not that kind of impact, at least some impact, which is not always a very dry narrative. Right? So I actually decided to talk about the story of how Black Taj came into being, how the idea of Black Taj came into being, as opposed to be choosing to be completely dismissive about it. It is, does not exist in history, or for that matter, how this whole idea of Jodhabai's, there's Zarina who's the courtesan who curses Fatehpur Sikri, and this whole idea of water, or instead about the palaces being named after Jodhabai, right? So the idea of a knowledge continuum, there are several sites which would need to be strengthened in this process of knowledge continuum, right? Making better quality books or more accessible books available. As I always say, that I never say that the rigor of research should be diluted, but there should be a medium of transmission of that knowledge in an accessible form in the public domain, so that people are able to make wider sense of history.
Uh, Thank you, sir. Ujjwal, you may unmute yourself and ask the question.
No, I think my answer is now, my question is now answered. I also had a question, just like Mansi had, about there are narratives like Tejo Mahal and about the Taj Mahal, and these communal narratives are being produced just to carry on their political agenda. So, sir, I just had that how can we make history engaging for the common masses?
Two or three things are important. One is that there has to be some kind of an intermediary platform, right? how people trained in history could occupy a variety of spaces, that are linked to the knowledge formation or knowledge consumption in the popular sector, right? As I said, one of those ways in which, this augurs for a lot of spaces opening up by way of careers as well, right? So the heritage photography or the heritage walks, or a lot of other things that I talked about, informal notions of that, if there are people who are trained in history could occupy those spaces, as also making research available in a more accessible format, right? Also, this whole idea about translations, not only in Hindi but also in regional, other regional Indian languages as well. So it has to be a multi-pronged approach, and and that idea would have to be taken further in terms of that. Uh, so this claims would continue to be made, basically, right? And one could not be entirely dismissive, but you have to engage with those claims in a more systematic and more creative ways rather than just brushing them aside, basically. So one of the ways in which I talk about that, is that, this is P.N. Oak's thesis that he says that, there was a temple existing earlier. And then if you just unfold that narrative, there was a court case in 2015 where, when, five lawyers filed a civil in a civil case in Agra court, and the ASI was made one of those, asked to present its view, and ASI for the first time said that no, it is a tomb and not a temple. And then to 2017, there was a response by the culture ministry in the parliament reaffirming what ASI said, right? So once you look at it in terms of long-term views, also looking at it in terms of a long-term frame, lot of answers got answered there. But this accessibility and about this making this knowledge more informed. Otherwise, there is a lot of good research happening in the academic settings, but not reaching out to the people. Right. So, but on the contrary, what people are, faced with is, very easy stories which are available on your WhatsApps or, social media sites, or short stories which are coming on popular platforms. And many people who are not used to this idea found these stories more interesting and fall for it, basically. Where is lies the danger of history? So I think some kind of a accessibility in the transmission of this very good research that is happening in academic settings should should be worked out.
Uh, Thank you, Ujjwal, for the question. Now, I think we'll have a last question, or maybe one or two before ending the session. So, Sejal, you may unmute your mic and ask the question.
Hello, sir. So my question is, how do you see literature as a source of history? Is it a reliable source, or it just creates chaos when it comes to unauthentic fabrication?
Uh, Sejal, literature, there are people who would argue work purely on literature and talk about very convincing histories as well, right? But generally, as we all do during our, things, we always look for things which come from a corroboration of sources, something which has been mentioned somewhere also finds a congruence in some other source. So a place where there is a convergence of sources always helps us, establish the, thing from fact from being just a proposition to a historical fact. As E.H. Carr says that, somebody says something and somebody starts endorsing it. So there's a network which is a research network that builds us. But usually, corroboration of sources always helps, establishing an idea from a pure proposition to some kind of a historical fact. And yet it remains open to debate. Basically, tomorrow, if there's something else comes up by way of an excavation or by way of a new discovery, you are still open to that. So, that part also you need to be very, very cautious about. That there's nothing called a complete, truth, in terms of that. So we are establishing more towards situation which is more likely to have happened, as opposed to something which is a completely definitive view of what had actually happened slide by slide, or the way it is like this. So that is what the brilliance of research. New research keep coming up. So for instance, in the case of Qutub, there are people who say that, whether that pillar was, brought from outside or erected by someone else or from Iltutmish, or so there's a lot of things which are, changing our understanding of the Qutub as well. So people are looking at, the way the language that has been used in the inscription, the way the script has been ornamented, right? So things like that. So literature definitely is one of the important source, but generally we look for corroborative evidence and convergence of sources before establishing some an idea or a proposition uh, as a historical fact.
Thank you, Sejal. Uh, does any professor wants to? We have thank you to the professors who have joined us. Is there any question from the professor, or if not, I will go to the last question. So, Mansi, you have I see you have another question, and I think it will be the last question of this session before ending. So, uh, oh, okay, Mayank sir, you can ask a question. Thank you.
नहीं शशांक, ये सौरभ क्वेश्चन नहीं है. शशांक, थैंक्स अ लॉट, मजा आ गया. Excellent. And the way history is problematized, and you have given us insight to that. And I don't have a question, Shashank. I only have a comment or query. और जो अभी लास्ट सवाल आया था सेजल का लिटरेचर को लेकर के, आई एम सिंपली वंडरिंग शशांक फॉर यू टू फर्दर इनलाइटन अस. यमुना को कालिंदी कहा जाता है, तो जो आखिरी स्लाइड थी तुम्हारी जिसके अंदर ताज का रिफ्लेक्शन दिख रहा है, उसके अंदर क्या कालिंदी लिटरेरी जो इमेजिनेशन यमुना का है उससे वो जोड़ा जा सकता है? क्योंकि सुगाता रे का बड़ा अच्छा काम आया है, क्लाइमेट चेंज एंड द आर्ट ऑफ डिवोशन, जियोस्थेटिक इन द ब्रिज एरिया. उसके अंदर वो बातचीत कर रहा है किस तरीके से जियोस्थेटिक इमर्ज कर रही है इन द कॉन्टेक्स्ट ऑफ यमुना, और यमुना कैसे सेंटर पॉइंट बन रही है उसके लिए. सो आई वाज वंडरिंग कि अगर उसके ऊपर तुम कुछ ऑफर करना चाहो. और दूसरा एक सवाल नहीं था, एक मेरा बस वो दिमाग में था कि इफ यू रीड बुक लाइक सीइंग लाइक अ स्टेट, जहां वो आर्ग्यू करता है कि जो प्लांट सिटीज हैं वो कैसे नहीं सरवाइव करती जब तक ऑर्गेनिक ग्रोथ ना हो. तो जब हम ताज और जब हम आगरा और फतेहपुर सीकरी को देखते हैं, फतेहपुर सीकरी फॉर मी इज अ फोर्ट एरिया, इज अ बेसिकली पैलेस एरिया, इट्स नॉट अ सिटी. जबकि आगरा इज अ सिटी. तो जो ऑर्गेनिक कनेक्शन विद द मासेस है विच इज विजिबल इन शाहजहानाबाद एंड लाल किला, दैट कुड नॉट डेवलप इन फतेहपुर सीकरी. So apart from the water issue, apart from the issue that its location, its organic growth is also one of the concern. That is how I see it. These are just simply my observations. Thanks, sir.
Mike, the first one, I do not have the the expertise or the knowledge to answer your first question about Kalindi and the Yamuna one. But this is a very interesting point, and I look into it. But that shot was also because the black thing is also because that's a shot in the sun around the sunset time, and that makes it very very apparent. And I just loved the shot so much that I took permission to use it at a variety of places, basically. But that's a very interesting point, and I'll look into that. Fatehpur Sikri, I'll slightly differ with you in the sense that and this is very interesting that you raised this question about that. See, they Sikri was planned as a city, as a camp city. So you have maps about how Mughal tents are planned, and a city which is planned, on there are two different determinants in Fatehpur Sikri. One is the planning about a Mughal encampment, and they use the same terminology for the buildings in Fatehpur Sikri. And the second one is about they follow the contours of a ridge. So the top of the ridge. So there are three different contours. On the top of the ridge is the masjid and the shrine. Basically, it's Salim Chishti's shrine, and the masjid is there, the Jami Masjid. The second part is where the palace is there, Daulat Khana e Khas, and the third rung is where the imperial establishments around are there. So Daulat e Khana Khas and hammams and the harem, imperial harem, and some of the imperial establishments are there, the second rung. So they follow the contours of a ridge, and it was actually very consciously planned as per the evidence around that. And this was a city which had gates, and there was a city which there was so there were imperial establishments, there were gardens, there were hammams, there were public works, right? The kind of connection that you say with the kind of masses did not come into being because Agra had developed over a very long period of time, and it had gone through from one settlement to another, to one settlement to another. I have a feeling that, and a point that I made in passing, that, they had different purposes. So Agra served a very strong purpose of the first phase of the expansion of the empire, with Agra fort symbolizing the defense bastions of the strength of the empire, right? So the Agra fort and the city around that had developed over a period of time, symbolized the strength of Mughal empire and the period of internal consolidation. Fatehpur Sikri, so there are different geographies, people and cultures which are being consolidated, which are being expanded, into the framework of the empire, which is Agra phase. Fatehpur Sikri is a phase which is a very experimental phase in the life of Akbar, where he's now confronted with integrating people's cultures and religions, and a point that he's faced not within the Islamic dispensation as well. There is a lot of opposition from the clergy about the various experiments that Akbar is doing, as also about the various other regions, Dholpur, Gwalior, Gujarat, and many historians actually say that Fatehpur Sikri was in effect an architectural response to the incorporation of Gujarat. So Fatehpur Sikri is more concerned about and you see it in the terms that are being used for different things. So Fatehpur Sikri is got more to do about bringing together people's cultures, integrating people's cultures, right, and also elevating the position of Sultan or position of the emperor in the eyes of the empire. So both serve different purposes. Agra comes back again to the military purposes again as well. But Agra symbolized, in a very broad sense, it's very difficult to argue in terms of stereotypical things. But Fatehpur Sikri, symbolize more a softer cultural side, which does not mean that they were not expansions, they were not military expeditions. Gujarat was expanded when Fatehpur Sikri was there very much. A lot of experiments came into place, but experiments like Ibadat Khana or Tawheed Ilahi, all this came into being when Akbar was at Fatehpur Sikri. So, or Mazhar Nama, where he proclaims internal differences within that. So, all these things come into play when Akbar was at Fatehpur Sikri. But the first question, I'll certainly look into it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Shashank. Thanks.
Okay, so I will conclude the lecture. Thank you, sir, for we are very grateful for the lecture. It was interesting and enlightening. Thank you to the listeners who joined. For further question, I have given the email, Instagram, and Facebook, so you can communicate with us, and we will further communicate with sir if you have further queries. Thank you to the professors and to the students who have joined. If it is possible, I would like Hopi sir to say a few words because he was quite he was quite helpful in organizing this lecture. So, Hopi sir, could you say a few lines as a conclusion?
No, I just have to say thanks to Sasank and the organizing committee headed by you along with Niru ma'am, because it gave me an opportunity to invite Sasank and give a chance to you all to listen to. So I thank Sasank on behalf of the entire department.
Thank you very much, and thank you all very much for being so patient with me and listening to my research. Thank you very much. It was indeed a great pleasure to be part of this event.
Right. Thank you everyone for attending Daroha 21. Even in the online session, it is quite enlightening to see such an issue. Thank you, and you may all leave the meeting.
Thank you. Thanks, Shashank. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.